share in this conversation and to facilitate a discussion really about mass incarceration and what continues to feed it, what are its historical roots, what is the fallout and the impact. But perhaps as important as all those factors are, to discuss how can we uh, deconstruct it? How can we create a new paradigm? How can we imagine a new future? Myself, I have a background working, going back to the 90s, working with youth, young people at Rikers Island at that time, and until very recently, as young as 16, of course, we had teenagers at Rikers Island in the adult system. We're still struggling around issues of youth and but also of people of all age, multi-generational impact of the justice system. I later had the chance to work at the W. Hayward Burns Institute, which is based out west in Oakland, but works nationally to address racial and ethnic disparities. So, and now I'm at the Department of Youth Rehabilitation Services, where I oversee juvenile justice services in Washington, D.C. Just a brief intro of myself, and really just humbled and happy to be able to be a part of this conversation. I believe we may want to, before we begin and introduce our illustrious panel and engage in a conversation, we may want to show an intro video to set the stage and provide some context for our conversation today. Is
The Full Participation is a human rights conference and arts festival is a movement, not a moment. It raises consciousness and mobilizes community support for norms, policies, and structures that advance the recognition of our collective humanity and full participation in the life of the community as a human right.
Full participation.
Full participation.
Full participation. Full participation.
Full participation as a human right means
to be included if you want to be included in whatever that is. So if that's employment and if that's your community, it's being engaged and it's contributing all that you have.
The ability to engage with others in just helping solve community issues.
In order to fully participate in something, that means we all have to be part of it.
All just are seen, we're all heard, we're all supported. Our humanity is valued and appreciated and supported through the systems that we are currently operating in.
acknowledging the issues around you and then making it like an issue, right? Like promoting it and making sure other people understand the problem and then taking action.
Participation to me just means being involved in things like for your community.
Full participation requires affirmative and interdependent rights to housing, healthcare, work with dignity, well-resourced, self-determined, sustainable communities, and more.
We began this conversation last year because we really wanted to explore what it was that people need to live.
And so full participation is a excellent theme, and I think critical, because it is a right and it is a responsibility. And it's required for us to move forward on critiquing and deconstructing the current paradigm, but reimagining a new one. And so, again, I'm humbled and very excited to have the opportunity to facilitate a discussion with some awesome activists and leaders who will serve as our panelists today. And thinking about today's discussion, the question of justice itself continued to ring in my mind and ears. The notion of what is justice. As I thought about that and continue to work on that issue, and as we all have, I've continued to listen to definitions and to thoughts about what justice can be. It brought me back to Dr. Martin Luther King, who said that true justice is an act of love in public, love in the public sphere, love in public policy. There is no other policy area or institution in this society other than justice. There is no greater need and demand for this notion of love and policy to be considered and to be applied as we reimagine, in my view. And so, without putting that idea in the parking lot for today, I'd rather say we can lift that up and hold that up as we have conversations about what justice can be and what we imagine for our society. I can think of many great people doing great work, but we are so fortunate today to have this outstanding panel of leaders. And I thank the conveners of this conversation and of this conference for getting such an awesome panel to have this conversation for leading work. We have with us today Shawanna Vaughn, Malaika Jabali, and Jose Saldana. All three leaders, activists in their own right, doing amazing work. And really to do justice to that work and to do justice to their introductions, I'd really like to have them introduce themselves. But with this question, as you give us a bit about yourself and your work, what is it that has brought you to this work? What is it that has led you to take this awesome task on to deconstruct, to decarcerate, to reimagine justice and how it can operate in our society? How can we change this culture? I'd like to begin with Malaika, if you could please share with us.
Sure. I would say that there are probably two main experiences, driving forces behind how I entered this work.
You think you can download Chrome on your computer?
So I was an African American Studies major in college, and in my last year, we had to do a senior internship. And around that time, I was struggling quite a bit because a really close friend of mine was killed in Detroit, and we learned that his body was found in the Detroit River, and he was robbed and shot at point blank range in the head. And the year that I did my internship, or I should say the spring semester when I was getting ready to graduate, I was working for the Legal Aid Society. That was my internship. And I had a defendant. I was preparing to go to law school. So I was working for a legal organization, a legal nonprofit. And the defendant, who was indigent, who we needed to support, was actually charged with a crime of murdering somebody and robbing them at gunpoint range. And so I couldn't help but think of my friend through all of this. And it was a very difficult, like I had to relive the trauma because I was looking at this profile of this man who I was now defending, who in my mind could have been my friend's killer. I mean, obviously I was in Georgia and my friend was killed in Detroit. So, it's not the same person, but it reminded me of the fact that you have a number of individuals in this society who feel shut out, they feel left out, they have all types of reasons why they end up committing violent crime. And instead of me being kind of reactionary, it was my job to say, what are the, like you all say, the interdependent forces that led to this crime? And I saw that he had bounced around from foster care to foster care. He had been expelled. And we don't ever like to humanize even criminal offenders, violent offenders. So I thought it was important to, whatever work that I do, to always look at systemic forces. And so much of my work has been looking at the ills of capitalism, the ills of white supremacy, the ills of patriarchy, even, that combine to create the kind of landscape that we have. And before I started law school, I went to the graduate school of the School of Social Work at Columbia University. And that's where I worked with with justice involved populations, a lot of them who were dealing with drug possession, and doing volunteering as well with drug lobbying in Albany. And so many of the excuses that we got from legislators as why we needed to incarcerate populations in these rural upstate areas was because they needed jobs. Like, that was the predominant reason. It was completely explicit. Like, they didn't try and hide it. They said, well, we need these prisons because we need jobs. So to see again the way that our ecosystem of oppression furthers exploitation of Black and brown communities really angered me. And so I've incorporated that work through a lot of my reporting and also my current work as a public policy attorney.
Thank you, Malaika. And, excited to come back to you as we continue the conversation. As in your introduction, you're speaking to, in your work, some of the pillars and the sort of contributors and drivers of mass incarceration and what upholds it. And so definitely want to circle back and get into that a bit more as we go forward. At this point, I'd like to turn to Shawanna Vaughn. Shawanna, please tell us a bit about yourself and what's brought you to this work.
Absolutely. So I would say my life, my own silent tears have brought me to this work at this moment. I was born in prison, in Corona State Prison for women, April 15th, 1978. I have been vended to the foster care system and back to prison. And so I understand the silent cries of those who have lived the system and counted out before you're ever counted in. So actually my life and experiences have brought me to this work. And I understand that it is going to take collectiveness to change it, to change the trajectory and the landscape of what it looks like and what it has looked like. And so my life has brought me here. The fact that I went to prison at 17, at Valley State Prison for Women, understanding that that wasn't the place for me. And though they say rehabilitation and correction, none of those things are adequate or hold true. It's actually harm, damage, and remnants of trauma that never get addressed. I don't believe that prison is the answer for everybody, for everything. And I think that economics and an extension of slavery plays an enormous part in why we see the numbers as they are, and especially for African American women and the rise of women going to prison as it is right now. And so these are some of the things that have brought me to the work and are going to keep me in the work. It is my life. It is a struggle knowing that I don't want other young people to ever have to face prison when we can create alternatives. And I know that children born to parents incarcerated are 4 times more likely to be incarcerated. And I'm one of them. And so I stand in the gap for children of incarcerated parents. I stand in the gap for no more generations of children going to prison. So that is why I am here in this work. And this is why I've created Silent Cry.
Thank you, Shawanna. And of course, your experiences in your current work and your life's work, as you described it, represents many voices and many issues involved in this issue of mass incarceration. Of course, this term credible messenger is used a lot these days. Those who have the life experience, and that voice continues to rise. And as we go on with this conversation, we definitely will depend on your voice as one with a direct experience, and also continuing to advocate and fight for change in terms of the impact on people. So we definitely will. So happy to have you here with us. I'd like to turn to Jose Saldana. Brother Saldana, please tell us about yourself and your life experience as well that's brought you to the world.
All right, thank you. And I'm very grateful to be a part of this discussion. I was born and raised in Spanish Harlem. We refer to it as El Barrio. And this is where I began my journey to where I am today. When I was 9 years old, I was befriended by a street worker, one of the sex workers that did business in a building right across from the building where I live. And I used to run errands for her. She must have been maybe 18 years old at best. And one day while I was running an errand for her, getting her some groceries from the local bodega, the cops raided the building. And as I was tiptoeing past them, I see two of them dragging her by her hair. I mean, down the stairs. Her head was hitting every stairs. She was bloodied all over. She didn't see me. She couldn't see me. And I froze. And I didn't know what to do. I never experienced anything like this. But them few moments of seeing what I saw to someone who I developed a very fond friendship with, them moments define what policing is in our community. And from that moment on, everything that happened in our community reaffirmed this definition of what policing is for us. In 1979, a group of young Puerto Rican men took over a church that my mother used to go to. They called themselves the Young Laws Party. And they took over the church for maybe 11 or 10 days until they were finally arrested and immediately released because the pastor actually told the cops that they had authorizations to be in the church. And from that day on, they would pass leaflets out, speak to us one-on-one. They would go from building to building, apartment to apartment, just speaking to the people. And because of the church takeover, they receive a lot of media attention. And they use that to expose the conditions in Spanish Harlem. At the time, there was an epidemic of tuberculosis. They exposed that. They exposed the rats that were basically living in our apartments, biting infants. They exposed the lead poisoning that infants were eating from the walls, the paint on the walls. And the garbage, that at the time there was a garbage strike, and I guess private sanitation services were provided to everybody else for Spanish Harlem. So all these iniquities that we just took for granted that this is the way it is, but we all knew that there was something terribly wrong with this, were exposed. And for the first time in my young life, I seen Spanish Harlem on the news. And they also exposed the conditions of drug addiction. At the time, I think a 10 or 11-year-old kid overdosed on drugs on a rooftop. The Young Laws did a service for him. And I attended the service. And during the service, they spoke about the evils of selling drugs, that drug dealers are basically collaborators with the system of oppression. And it was during this sermon, listening to the leaders of the Young Law Party, that I decided that I want to be a part of this. I joined the Young Laws Party. And that gave me the consciousness that I lacked. And it gave me the identity that I lack as a first-generation Puerto Rican. And it also gave me a lot of rage because now I'm understanding how this whole thing started. And unfortunately for me and my family, in 1979, I was arrested for attempted murder of a New York City police sergeant. I was convicted of that crime, as well as a series of bank robberies. And I received a sentence of 25 years to life. I was released less than 10 years. I was released less than 3 months, 3 years ago. Actually, I was released in January of 2018. And I joined the Release Aging People in Prison campaign. 10 months after I was released, the director and founder, one of the founders of RAP, passed away. And I was nominated and confirmed to be the next director of RAP. So when I left prison, I left men just like me, men who are perhaps more worthy than I am to be returned back to their families and communities. And I left with the determination that I would not go on with my life as if they never existed. And this is why today it is my passion, my dream, my vision to release as many men and women from prison as possible. Because I understand that most who have languished in prison 38 years like I did, or more, are victims of racist policies of mass incarceration. That the New York State Parole Board is perpetually denying parole to men and women who can safely be returned back to their communities are doing so because they are complicit in executing these racist policies of mass incarceration. And this is why I am committed to this mission in life. Thank you.
Thank you, Brother Saldana, again, for such a profound expression and articulation of your story, or a highlight thereof, and how it's impacted your thinking and your action and your leadership. And this process, this what I would call growing movement of leadership on the part of people most impacted, I think is critical. And as we continue to have this conversation, I'd like to highlight that, the need for that, and talk about that ongoing struggle to create the space and the platform for the appropriate leaders to take their place in this work. I'd like to go back a bit. And of course, in all of the opening conversations, thank you all for sharing some of your walk through this process. We've alluded to the roots of this situation, the roots of this system, which go back to the roots of this nation. We know that. And Malaika talked about, and I think all have at least alluded to the issue of white supremacy, the issue of structured racism as a part of the framework of this society, and other isms and processes. Malaika, could you speak some more about those driving forces and contributors to mass incarceration, or what one might call the pillars that continue to uphold it? I believe you're muted, Malaika.
Sure thing. I think it's important to also look at the historical context for how these pillars exist right now. And when you look at the history of policing, I'm sure that there's folks who are probably watching this who are familiar with this, but for those who aren't, there was always this intersection between white supremacy and empire building, or white supremacy and capital accumulation. And I think knowing and being familiar with that history will be very informative to how we got where we are right now with the highest incarceration rate in the country, where we have Black people who have a higher incarceration rate now than they did in 1968. where you have a higher gap in incarceration now between Black people and white people than we did in 1968. So we have these ongoing problems because we still have white supremacy and capitalism. And when you look at the roots of that, going from expanding this empire west from the Deep South and the 13 colonies to westward expansion, you can look at what's considered the first law enforcement organization were the Texas Rangers. And they were instituted in order to kill the Comanche Indians so that they could take their territory. So that's why we have, the Texas Rangers, who are normalized as a baseball team. These were murderers. These are people who killed people so that they could take their land. You can take that down to the Deep South in Southern plantations in the Carolinas, where police patrolmen were created. You had slave patrols that were created in order to control enslaved Black people. They were property, and so you had to rein your property in if you felt that they were getting out of line, if they were trying to escape, if they were doing anything that threatened the social order of white supremacy. You needed to have a police apparatus in order to control them. And that is where police came from in the South. And these were white people of various social classes. You didn't have to be a landowner. You didn't have to be a property owner. In fact, in order to buy into whiteness, in order to reap the wages of whiteness, as W.E.B. Du Bois talks about in Black Reconstruction, to get some return on your wage, you invested in this system. And through that system, you exploited other people. And then you can take that up north to industrialization. So the the profits that were gained from exploiting our bodies, from exploiting our talent, from exploiting us, our minds as a people, created massive industry in the Northeast. And because of that, you ended up having wage labor. So then you have factory workers, but you also have to control factory workers. And these were people of all races. So then you had the first police precincts that were created to control labor unrest, because of course they're not going to treat them well either, because they want to make money by any means necessary. And so that line of exploitation has been a continuous line, as Angela Davis would say. It is an unbroken line from the exploitation of that era to now. We're still talking about exploiting people for profits, whether it's a private sector prison or whether it is a public sector prison. In order to get tax revenue, you need to be able to get as many people corralled as possible because we don't have jobs anymore. So all of this is interconnected.
Wow, thank you for that. I mean, it's such a long and profound history that you highlighted in a few moments, but really opens the door to a view of the system that the powers that be, the systems themselves would have us to ignore or not to understand. And I'm not so sure about their conscious awareness. There's certainly awareness on the part of people in power, but it's turned into such a machine that it seems to just operate in such a destructive way. And as you describe the roots of it and the intention of the system as we know it, clearly this is not a case, as some would argue, of a few bad police, a few bad judges, a few bad correctional officers, or what have you, that we're talking about a whole framework, a whole structure, and a whole machine that has destroyed lives and families and communities. And I wanted us to not just dwell entirely today on that destruction, but I think we have to talk about that. I think we have to call that out. And I think that the stories of people impacted must be told. What you've described has had such real impact on real lives, countless. But they have names, they have families, and they have stories. And Shawanna, you're here as one voice, Brother Jose as well, to talk about that lived experience. But Can you talk with us, Shawanna, about the conditions, the impact, like not inside of facilities, yes, but also overall? How would you describe what impact this system has had on real people and real lives?
Absolutely. I would say that the impact that the industrial complex has had on real lives is catastrophic. I would begin with my mother, um, who went to prison for no more than using drugs that was also flooded in her community, not by her. And she was not afforded the opportunity in 1978 to have rehabilitation or drug programs, only prison. Prison was not the resolution to deal with her trauma. And the effects of her trauma was having children. Um, Myself being born in prison, and her other children being raised by her mother and eventually making their way into the foster care system as well. I think the remnants of mass incarceration are generational. They are long lasting. Currently, right now, have legislation that will be introduced in New York here shortly called post incarceration prison disorder, Shawanna W76337. I think that the remnants are mentally scarring for life. I think everybody comes home from incarceration with a different set of trauma. And I don't think that we deal with them as a country. I don't think we deal with them as people. And so I believe that I was in trauma probably 9 times before I ever got to prison. That's how I got to prison. And we don't deal with generational trauma. And prison is one of the most vilest places I believe you could put a human to say that you are reforming or fixing them. I don't think it did me any good. I don't think it fixed or reformed me. I think that was a conscious decision after incarceration that I wanted to be whole. And it's a fight to be whole. Um, I realized when you walk the length of a jail cell in your own home, that when you for those who are not and have never been incarcerated, um, there's a thing you cook with in prison called a stinger, and it's a metal coil, and you just put it in water to cook food. But when you actually buy one and you're free, that's trauma, because I wanted to remember what that was so I can never go back to it. Um, Post-traumatic prison disorder, Shawanna W76337, will allow individuals the opportunity to receive holistic, comprehensive mental health services, which are not afforded in prison. Um, Prison is a big brand pharmaceutical business. I watched a lot of individuals come in that weren't substance abuse people, who did not use drugs, and prison puts pills down your throat. And you leave with issues and problems that you did not walk in with, because nobody ever says that prison is the biggest drug dealer. And the pharmaceutical companies are feeding individuals pills hand over foot. And that is, for me, a huge problem. That the mental health continues recidivism. And without, if you fix someone's mind, like Messiah said yesterday, the body will follow. So that is actually one of my big issues with prison, is the mental effects and the remnants of it. And that is the thing that has mostly impacted and affected my life. So that is what I champion and I fight for.
Wow. So, actually creating further chemical dependency through the pharmaceutical approach. I won't even call it an approach to treatment. I'll call it a practice on the part of these systems. It is profound, the impact that you're describing, and the response, though, that you are, and the solutions that you're putting forth. I feel that this concept of, and if you could share it again, the name of the bill and the concept of post-incarceration.
Yes, it's called post-traumatic prison disorder, Shawanna W76337.
Yeah.
And I said that because it's not PTSD. It's not
Right.
the same effects as the military, nor is it the same benefits, because you don't look at a person coming out of incarceration as a hero. And so we're not afforded the same opportunities that come with post-traumatic stress disorder. I don't like the word syndrome, so I don't use that. So for me, I have post-traumatic prison disorder. So I gave a title to something that I believe is valid. And I think that we should allow, in my legislation, I'm calling for vendor therapy. I'm calling for trauma-informed therapists. I personally actually have one of the most amazing women psychologists on my board. Her name is Dr. Carol Ann Hunt Griffith, and she's trauma-informed. And I believe that if we are going to cure anything, we have to have the right people to be able to aid other people. And we don't have trauma-informed therapists in prison. For those of us who've been incarcerated, we know that the people that are in prison, as far as medical care is concerned, are people who cannot practice anywhere else. And that means they're not credible or qualified. That's why they work in a prison. And those are the people that we do not want any longer to be with contracts. And so I'm asking for vendor therapy, because that's never been asked for. I'm asking for trauma-informed therapists. That's not been asked for. I'm asking that 60 days upon incarceration, that we address people's traumas until their release date or until something else happens, and that we leave prison with Medicaid cards and referral services, so people don't fall through the cracks, that people have a therapist to go to when they get home, and the things that they need, so they don't fall off. Because we're clear that therapy costs money. And we say it takes $36,000 to incarcerate. How much money does it take to heal? I think it's time we shift how we view incarceration and how we view healing, and who should be afforded healing. Because that's a problem, and that goes back to racism and white supremacy. Who is afforded to be whole in this society? I believe that I deserve to be whole. And so, because I haven't seen it, I wrote it. And I'm hoping that it changes the narrative for New York State and everybody else. And I'm hoping that people support this legislation and support mental health. You can't support mental health for some and not mental health and wellness and totality of healing for all.
In your question, who deserves holistic treatment, who deserves wellness, it just directly connects to the profound statement that Black Lives Matter, the one which we should have to continue to affirm. And in listening to you, I'm reminded that this Black Lives Matter is much more than a cry against deadly police force. That our entire existence, what is the value of our life? What's the value of Black life, of Black and brown people, of marginalized people's life. And your word and your words and your advocacy are answering that question and pushing forward a true paradigm shift, a true example of love and policy, a health care policy that truly seeks to heal and rebuild and bring wellness. But also listening to you and Malaika and Jose, several questions arise out of your words in terms of moving forward. Brother Jose, we've had some conversation today about the roots of this system, its foundations in the foundation of white supremacy and slavery, and post-slavery policies and practices that sought to continue to dehumanize and in many ways enslave Black people. And so the struggle has continued. And I would ask you if you could sort of pick up on when you were describing your experience and your response and then joining the Young Lords and fighting in that context for change. Can you talk about the key issues that you're working on in your work now and throughout your history of this work to not just address immediate issues, but to fundamentally redefine the way the system operates?
Yes. During the last 10 years of my incarceration, as I was preparing for, the New York State Parole Board to be interviewed and evaluated for release, men who were just a couple of years older than me were dying in prison. And then I discovered that in the 10-year span, 1,000 people have died in New York State prisons. It's no surprise that 700 of those were people of color, mostly Black and Latinx people. But what surprised me to a degree was that the average age of death was 58 years old. The brutality of incarceration has reduced longevity for Black and Latinx incarcerated men and women to 58 years old. So there came a time where I started to suspect that I may very well be next. So when rap was started to formulate, because it evolved from this crisis that was created by mass incarceration, the crisis of men and women getting harsher sentences and little opportunity on the back end for release because of the parole board's complicity in mass incarceration. In between, men were just getting older, sick, and dying. So there was this crisis that rap tried to address as a means of decarcerating toward ending mass incarceration. And while I was preparing for my parole boards, rap did something that we were trying to do for years unsuccessfully. They challenged the composition of the New York State Parole Board. Because at the time, and for decades, 4 to 5 decades, the New York State Parole Board was dominated by people with law enforcement backgrounds. People who could not see past the crime that was committed no matter how many decades ago. People who did not believe that human beings, under the worst of circumstances, could transform their lives and become better human beings. They just couldn't see that. It was beyond their experience in their relationship with us. So rap challenged that composition. And when not the most, but some of the most punitive-minded parole commissioners' term expired in 2017 of June, rap submitted a list of potential parole commissioners. The governor did not reappoint them as is customarily do. It's just something, they get 6-year appointments and then they serve their 6 years, they do another 6 years, and it becomes their second career. But he did not do that this time because RAP submitted evidence of their racist attitudes, their racist hearings, their unfair hearing practices and policies. So instead, he appointed 6 new commissioners from a diversified background. One of those new commissioners was the lead commissioner when I appeared before the parole board in November of 2017. She had a social service background. And she asked me one question about the crimes that I committed in 1979. Prior to then, that's all they were asked about. And the hearings would last 10, 12 minutes at most, because their mind was already set. It was already predetermined that I was going to be denied parole again. But with this hearing, with this new commissioner, she asked me that one question about the crime, and then her next words were, now let's talk about what you've been doing the last 38 years of your life. And based on what was before her, all my accomplishments, she released me, granted me parole. This is why I was released from New York State prisons in January of 2018. So what RAP did worked. It worked to a degree. It moved the dial a little. It created my freedom, because if it wasn't for RAP, I would still be in a prison cell. Other men with even more serious crimes against law enforcement were also released. Not nearly enough, of course, but at least after 4 decades, 45 years, men were being released on a very limited basis. In fact, the release rate actually doubled in 3 years because of the advocacy and community organizing of RAP and other grassroots community organizations. So this worked, and this is what we continue. And this is the legacy that the founders left us. Mujahid Fareed, Laura Whitehall, Kathy Boudin. These are the 3 founders of RAP. And this is why we continue to do this work, because it worked. Even during the pandemic, we was able to at least increase the rate of release based on our advocacy. And we advocate for 2 bills that we believe will transform the New York State parole system and toward decarceration, toward dismantling the entire criminal legal system that is dominated by the legacy of racism. This bill is the elder parole bill, which actually just calls for an interview, a parole interview for anyone who is 55 years old and has served 15 years. They will automatically be entitled to an interview, no matter what the crime or conviction, and no matter how much time the person has been sentenced to. And this is really revolutionary in the sense that it negates such sentences of life without parole. It also negates such virtual death sentence like 75 years to life. And the other bill that we advocate for gives meat to the elder parole bill, because it provides that the parole board can no longer just deny parole based on the nature of the crime that was committed years or decades ago. That they must make an evaluation based on who the person is today. So we believe these 2 bills and our work towards changing the entire composition of New York State Parole Board, where every parole commissioner must believe that human beings can transform their lives. These 3 initiatives, we believe, will go a long way toward at least chipping away at this mass incarceration, and hopefully will release men and women who have already languished in prison, some for over 4 decades. At least let them spend the rest of their lives, the years that we have left, with their families. And I just want to mention one story that recently happened that breaks our heart. A friend of mine, a mentor, named Salih Ali Abdullah, 73 years old, has served 48 years, has been denied parole by the New York State Parole Board 13 consecutive times. He appeared before his 14th parole hearing. And during the hearing, he asked if he could go to the bathroom. When they gave him permission to go to the bathroom and he didn't return, they wondered what's taking him so long. A CO went to the bathroom to check up on him, and he was laid out on the ground, right on the floor of the bathroom. He had a massive stroke. He never recovered. He was rushed to the outside hospital and passed away 10 days later. Here's a man that should have been returned to his family years ago. In fact, decades ago. He wasn't sentenced to 48 years. He was sentenced to 25 years. But that's just to show you the brutality, the inhumanity of this system, of anyone who is complicit in instituting these racist policies. That it just shows you how we cannot overlook any institution that supports this type of inhumane oppression of Black and Latinx people. And we all have to come to this realization that Black lives matter and incarcerated Black lives equally matter.
And could you please follow up with just a bit of information on the numbers of elder brothers and sisters who are incarcerated? I can only, and have done some reading, some of the research that you and your organization has done with regards to the millions of dollars that are spent to incarcerate our elder brothers and sisters, and the numbers of them. It must be astounding, the amount of resources that are poured into needlessly, cruelly keeping people incarcerated. If I may connect to that question, could you say a bit about the politics of the issues of that fight? Who are the strong advocates to continue this policy? Is it correctional unions? What is that fight?
Law enforcement. Law enforcement have a historical vested interest in just maintaining this oppressive system and maintaining the legacy of racism and continue to hold our communities marginalized and powerless. In fact, I mean, just briefly go back that the policies, the racist policies of mass incarceration always existed. It existed for centuries, but it took on a different focus during the civil rights movement and during what they call the militant era of the 60s and 70s, because the focus then became on murdering the leaders and incarcerating those who they do not murder, and also to control the communities of color that support the movements that resisted racial and social injustice. And this is why our communities were targeted the way they were. Young men who were idealists were targeted and criminalized for being young Black men, young Latinx men. Everyone who they feel will support the movements for racial and social justice were targeted. And this is why prisons across the country were automatically filled up with people from our communities. And the impact of this in our communities. And when I went to prison, I had 4 children, 1-year-old all the way up to 8 years old. And I just want to say that the impact of this is so devastating and so far-reaching that it astounds me even today. It astounds me that my youngest daughter came to visit me as she was going to her first year of college. And she came to visit, a surprise visit, mind you. And she came to visit me to tell me that she resented me her entire life, that she could remember, because I was not there for her. And even though I wasn't a deadbeat dad, I continued to support my family throughout the decades of incarceration, but she said she didn't care about that. I wasn't there in the moments when she needed me the most, and went on to tell me every moment that she needed me that I wasn't there. And I try to play the innocent card, and it's shameful, but I try to play the innocent card. And then I told her, but baby, they framed me. When that didn't work, I told her, I said, you know, I was part of a movement, and they just swept us all up and put us all in prison and convicted us on these trumped up charges. And she just looked at me and said, what do you think that means to a little girl who just wants her daddy home? And my oldest daughter refused today, to this very day, she refused to have children because of the fear, that ingrained, deeply rooted fear that she had, that the father of her child may very well go to jail and her child will go through what she went through. And these things were never even addressed until recently. But that just goes to show you that this is not just a fight about people in prison, people formerly incarcerated. This is a fight that our communities have to unite to stop. We have to come together as people to end this vicious, racist system of mass incarceration.
Yeah, thank you so much, brother. And I think we have to hear that. We have to sit with that. Like, we have to confront what you're talking about. You know, appreciate you sharing your personal story. This is representative of countless, of thousands and thousands of stories of impact. And thankfully that impact, that experience, and the people as yourselves who have had this experience are leading a movement, a growing movement, a multifaceted movement to address mass incarceration and address the entire so-called justice system as we know it. I wanted to open up the floor. I've been asking you all individual questions, but please feel free to jump in on any of these questions. You know, as we go forward, certainly we know you all have insight into everything that we're talking about. If I could just start though, and maybe ask Malaika if you could start a conversation for all of us to have with regard to the movement, if I could use that as a collective term. And one aspect, one part of that has been framed or branded by some as defund the police. Speaking of really, you know, just deconstructing and starting from scratch. Can you talk about that? Your thoughts about that, and perhaps articulate the aims of that? I think in the public discourse, some of these terms are thrown around and they're critiqued, but I think it would really be helpful for us to have a deeper conversation about what they mean and what is the aspiration here.
I want to start off by bringing my humility here, because this is work that I have learned from radical Black women who first exposed me to this idea of abolition. And that was maybe about a decade ago when I first heard about this. I grew up in the movement. I grew up in the New African People's Organization, which is a Black radical organization in the South. And one of the young women that I grew up with, I was talking to her. I don't know how we ended up in the conversation, but that was the first time I even heard about modern day abolition. And at the time I was like, how does that even work? And when you dig into it, you could see that there is, like, this is scholarly research. This is work from activists. This is based on studies and a whole field of study that people have been working with, and a lot of Black women have been grappling with for years and years. You could go to Ruth Wilson Gilmore, Angela Davis, Miriam Kaba, who my interaction with her is where I started to, I think, accept it and understand it more. So I say that to say that I'm a student of abolition. I report on abolition. I'm a baby abolitionist, but there is expertise out there that I think people should work with first, including those women whose work is out there. It's available. You can also go to criticalresistance.org or aidtoabolition.com. And I think a part of this is, I don't think it's something that you can really feel or understand like in a conversation like this. I think it's something that we all have to work with, because as an attorney who went through law school and we understood the history of criminal law, so much of it is about our feelings, our emotions, and our values. So even if you give people all the stats, even if you tell people, well, when you look at the crimes that police officers are actually solving, it's very little. They're actually doing little when it comes to felonies. People hear that like, oh, I know, but X, Y, and Z happened to my friend, and this is how I feel about it. That doesn't seem right to me. So a lot of it, I think, is a personal journey to unlearn the values and the attention and the priority we give towards punishment and the feeling of punishment and what retribution looks like. So I think it's as much of a mental and a value system process to unlearn as it is understanding the stats and what it means, to defund through a budget and all the technical ideas. So I just wanted to say that first. But in terms of what abolitionists have been talking about is we need an end to mass incarceration and we need an end to policing. And we're talking about policing primarily because that is the first step. And that is where we're seeing a lot of these violent encounters. We have like public terrorism. We have lynching in our communities of disproportionately Black men, but also Black women. Obviously, we are fresh on the heels of the Breonna Taylor case. I was just in Atlanta reporting on the Rayshard Brooks case. And there's a whole system that flows from policing, which are those first interactions, that first step where our communities are being sieged by white supremacist ideas about Black and brown criminality. And in order to get rid of the system of mass incarceration, you have to start with a system of policing because, you have the arrest, you have the booking, you have, the charges or an indictment from that. And so that's where it really has to start. And not only are you, by ending policing and finding other alternatives to public safety, this is not about, running rampant and everybody just being willy-nilly. It's about having a community process for public safety, community control, not over policing, but community control for how do we engage with each other? How do we interact with each other? And if you can first say we don't have this terrorist group that is harassing young Black, brown men and women, we can get rid of that force. You are also dedicating resources to the things that underlie policing and incarceration and crime. So you can dedicate those resources to education. You can dedicate that to mental health resources. We're spending billions and billions of dollars on policing, and we have military grade equipment. This comes from both parties allocating federal resources to incentivize policing and to incentivize this militarization of the police. So we don't need assault grade weapons in our communities. That costs money. That money could be going to pay a kids for their books, to be pay for their computers. We need remote learning. So all of these resources that we are dedicating to this system that is actually very ineffective can be going to the things that actually promote public safety and harm reduction.
And so there are, thank you so much for that, for framing that for us, because I think there is fair to say, a continuum or a spectrum of thoughts, of ideology or philosophy, but then also action, right? That seeks to address these issues that we're talking about. And at one part of that continuum is this idea of abolition and a tearing down, deconstruction of the current structure, as you said, at the first point of contact in the justice continuum or the criminal system, at being policing. I think, Malaika, I appreciate you pushing us forward here, because I think we're now more directly starting to speak to what we want, we've talked about what we've experienced, and certainly talking about tremendous activism and real solutions for sure. I'd like for, if we can, to start talking about what we would replace this with? And it's not to jump ahead of the tremendous work that must be done to break down and to deconstruct what exists and how it's impacting people. But one thought and one movement that seems to be growing, and some people use the term restorative justice, and it may mean different things to different people. Of course, what continues to advance the conversation from restorative justice is transformative justice. And it starts to speak to and raise questions and answer some questions around how can a new paradigm advance peace and wellness and resolve conflicts in a drastically, radically different way than the current system does. To what extent, from your point of view, is the movement providing or offering some solutions or alternatives to create a new reality? Anybody who would like to speak to that?
Yeah, I think well, let me just first say it's for in response to Malaika that you have 9,000 elder people in prison in New York State. It costs us at least 140,000 a year to incarcerate such men and women. So you times a little over 9,000 times 140,000. That's the money that could be allocated to social services. That money could be allocated to provide at least the beginning of an alternative solution. Not that they will do that, because we know that they won't. But we're looking at the waste of money just to keep people in prison. And people that cannot really justify keeping such people in prison. And throughout the years of my incarceration, we have envisioned a world without prisons, because we see the brutality of this prison. We see that these guards do nothing, absolutely nothing. The teachers that work, the civilians that work there do nothing. We are the ones at the blackboards teaching the younger generation and some older folks the basic educational skills that they need to learn. So we can do without them. In fact, we can do without the walls. We could do without the bars, because we've done more to transform the lives of a generation of incarcerated men than the Department of Correction could ever claim credit for. So the vision of an alternative future without prisons is already there for us. We just have to develop on it and make revisions and modifications so that the community could benefit from it. And although we are an advocacy group, we try to change laws, but most of us who are out here advocating for a change of laws that will release men and women from these death sentences, we have also been transformed through these very programs that we helped develop.
Yes, thank you, Brother Jose. That's exactly the direction the movement is going, and and as you described, a vision, visions and thoughts and even plans, some would describe, for an alternative way of experiencing justice, of solving problems, of creating wellness and safety, if you want to use that word. That word is so charged, public safety. I don't really like to use it because it's the way it's weaponized by the current system. But the notion, though, of communities and families living in peaceful ways, and how do we promote that? Obviously, that's so connected with so many forces and factors in our society, economic and political and what have you. But I feel that, and in our conversation today, you all have been describing what the new reality can be. Shawanna, when you talk about how we think about trauma and how we address that. And of course, you all are talking about what causes the trauma in the first place. But I continue to, raise the question and continue to push myself to develop the new reality. If I may share briefly, as the director of the youth justice system in Washington, D.C., we've been continuing to fight and to struggle to essentially decarcerate, to keep young people in the community who are in the justice system at home, safely engaged by credible messengers and other community um, uh, folk and organizations. And in fact, DC built a facility and closed a 300 bed, 250 bed prison, horror show of a prison, some 15 years ago, 10 years ago, and built a new facility, a 60 bed facility, which has state of the art, facilities. And it has the Maya Angelou Charter School where young people are getting excellent education. And it has good food, nutritious food that we would eat, that we eat, that the young people eat, that we would want our children to eat. It has behavioral wellness professionals and credible messengers from the community who themselves have been system impacted, who work around the clock in the facility with the young people, and opens up the doors for community to come in, and all these innovations on what incarceration could be. And for some, and we get visits from all over the country, and for some, it is the new frontier, and it certainly is a quantum leap from what most youth justice correctional facilities look like and how they operate. And we've dared to imagine and try to figure out, back to Martin Luther King's words, what love looks like. How could you infuse love into such a place? I say all of that to say, though, it's not the final frontier. Like, it's not, and for some they think it is. As we finally created a humane youth prison, right? And we're certainly proud of our efforts to humanize and to address issues, but it's not the final frontier. So I guess I use that as a concrete example in my work, right? And the work that we're doing in DC to continue the conversation, though. How do we close such a place, right? How do we keep those young people, and we've reduced at time the population down to 10 young people, right? And quite a bit of praise and congratulations for that come our way. But at the end of the day, there's this larger question, I think, around our societies and our notion that has us believe that we do need some people to be behind bars or behind barbed wire, right? I don't accept that, and I don't believe we accept that. So we continue to strive for ways of surrounding and supporting and nurturing and healing even our most troubled of people and young people in community. So I throw it back out there to the panel to perhaps selfishly, you all will help me with my issues there and our work there, but also to the larger conversation and to all of our audience listening. Can we talk about more, perhaps pointedly, about alternatives to, and not just alternatives, a new reality, a new way of working with and surrounding and supporting people outside of this current paradigm? What does that look like to you?
Well, let me say that I think that we need to start redefining terms, like justice. Right now, justice means perpetual punishment and vengeance. Justice has to also include mercy and forgiveness and redemption. If we start defining terms in this criminal legal systems that heal rather than create further harm, then I think that's a good foundation. And during the time that we were developing these therapeutic programs, we did not discriminate against anybody that was convicted of what others may say the most horrific offenses. And over the years, we found that even those who were convicted of the most horrific offenses, and in some people's eyes, crime I was convicted of is a horrific offense, that these men and young men were able to change their whole thinking. And we saw success there. So this is why rap does not exclude anybody from parole justice. It does not exclude anybody from human justice before these courts that seek to just give people death by incarceration sentences. And we base that principle on our history, our understanding of history, that they try to exclude us from everything. As a people, they try to exclude us from the human race. They said we was 3/5. They try to exclude us from the human race. They try to exclude us from civic opportunities, even civic rights. So we don't turn around and on the basis of a crime or conviction or sentence exclude other people. And again, the programs that we develop founded on the social principles of restorative justice. We try to revise it a little bit so that the younger generation could be receptive to it. But we believe that this system that focuses on healing and not punishment is something that is promising for us. And I think that if we continue to develop it, if we continue to disregard that notion that we need prisons, but we need incarceration, even for some, if we just throw that out the window, it doesn't work, it never worked. It was all designed to keep us under this oppressive condition. If we just abandon that and focus on developing something that heals everyone, I think that we're on toward a more humane and just a system of resolving conflicts, transgressions of every sort.
Yeah, thank you. I wrote that. I mean, mercy, redemption, forgiveness, powerful concepts, values that you've uplifted there that must inform the new reality. Thank you. I don't know if Malaika or Shawanna, you wanted to weigh in on that particular question. Please feel free if you'd like.
I absolutely would agree with Mr. Saldana that I believe that redemption through optic lenses is needed, it's vital, it's necessary, and it's powerful. Like I said before, who determines worth and value? And if you are the person who is determining someone's freedom, then you have to look at redemption through optic lenses. And you have to not look at the crime, but you have to look at the entire person. And I think, kudos to you, Mr. Lacey, for creating a new type of housing for young people. But prison as we know it has to be abolished. It cannot exist. Where the food says not fit for human consumption. If you send me somewhere and it's animalistic, with cages and bars and food not fit for humans and healthcare that is not adequate in third world countries. But you said you sent me here to be better. That's not true. And so I believe that we have to find a better way. There has to be, we no longer can have bars and cells and solitary. This is cruel and unusual punishment.
Mm-hmm.
And we have groups who are against animal cruelty. Yet we have people languishing in prisons, and the cruelty to that is horrific. And I don't see those same people who are screaming for the animals, screaming for human life. We have to figure out a new way to create wealth, because white supremacy and racism and capitalism is not helping. It is we're suffering because of it. And I believe that if we start changing the narrative of what prison looks like, I really want to see a Fair Wage Act in 2021. And I mean, really a Fair Wage Act. If we start pulling people's pensions and all the funding out of private and state prisons, prison would start to look different. When there was no money to be gained, prison, I believe, would look different. I don't believe that anyone should ever have to languish in a prison. It's not the answer. No neighbor is safer because someone is in prison. And if you're patting yourself on the back as a juror or somebody who is investing in prisons, it's no good. Know that it is tearing up a nation. It is not building anything. It is destructive. And so I believe that, abolishment has to have a plan. Like, RAP's legislation, like the things that Malaika talks about, like policies that I'm working on, and recreating structures as you've done, Mr. Lacey, to begin to on the road to decarceration. So I'm grateful for everybody that is here, that collectively we can work towards the race to decarceration.
Thank you so much for that. And yes, I mean, it's so encouraging that you all panelists here, the work that you're doing, but who you represent, right? The others, the other large numbers of people who aren't on this panel today, but who are out there doing the work. And those in the audience, we'd like to turn to you as well and open up the chat for comments and questions and conversation as we continue this really profound conversation and the contributions that our panelists are making to it. So please, audience, weigh in if you have any questions or comments. And as we wait for those comments and questions to come in, the word culture continued to come to mind throughout this conversation. The creation of a new, perhaps a return to our roots, but tapping into a culture that's drastically, radically different than that which supports the current framework. Malaika, is that something that you've thought about in your work as it connects to the analysis of the problem as well as the solutions that are being advocated?
Well, I can talk about that. I think there are two things that we can think about here is both a value system and a culture that is rooted in America's individualism, and secondly, the kind of counterculture that we need to challenge that, and also to make sure that we're building our own communities up internally through self-determination. And so I touched on the former already. We know that America is individualistic. It encourages people to call the police. It encourages people to protect their property. So you have these interactions with police officers to begin with. It encourages wealth hoarding and thinking of other people, thinking of Black and brown people, Black people specifically, as a violent other. It encourages a capitalist society to also have profit-driven governments who are seizing people's assets, charging people with small, minor, non-violent offenses just to get money. But as we talk about transforming what this system looks like and being visionary, I'm reminded, someone, Laura, put in the comments some information about the New African Peoples Organization, which is what I said, one of the Black radical groups that I grew up with. It was having a sense of community. So when we're thinking about alternatives to incarceration, we also have to think about alternatives to this entire oppressive system. And for us, we wanted to create another society. Just to talk about the history a little bit, we were talking about Black nationalism and having a nation within a nation. And when you have a nation within a nation, you have people who feel accountable to each other. You have self-love. I was taught about Black history from the time I was like 3 years old. I went to a school that was Afrocentric. And so when you love your people, when you know your neighbor, when you are accountable to your neighbor, I believe that that has an impact on how you treat them, how you respect them, how you interact with people. And it minimizes, I have not done, academic studies on this, but this is just my anecdotal experience. It minimizes the kind of engagement that can lead to violent crime, because if you're not, if you don't hold those standards for yourself, your auntie gonna see it, your, group leader's gonna see it, your pastor's gonna see it. So between that experience and also growing up in the Shrine of the Black Madonna, which is also a Black radical organization that focuses on Black liberation theology, we felt responsible for our people. We felt responsible for our liberation, and harming each other runs counter to that. We cannot liberate ourselves if we are the ones who are also a part of the problem. And I'm not using this within the context of other people. Well, Black on Black crime, what about that? I think we have to have two separate conversations. So when someone's talking about police violence, we don't need to be talking about Black on Black crime. But when it comes to what we can do and the things that are within our control, being accountable to each other, having that pride, following, principles of Kwanzaa, and countering a system that encourage us to fight each other, that encourage us to inflict harm on each other, I think is very, very crucial to this whole project.
Indeed, yes, thank you. It's such a powerful. Those are such powerful forces, and that are interwoven into culture. So thank you for sharing that. I wanted to ask Brother Jose, what the work of rap, how is it, in your view, connecting to the community, to the wider community? Certainly it's impacting people who are trying to get back to their families and are getting back to their families. Could you talk a bit about the networks that your work connects to with regards to this larger movement?
Yes, first I want to say that one of the fundamental principles of rap and just about everything we do stems from this foundation, that we not only recognize the humanity of all people, we embrace their humanity. And I want to mention a story that took me to the place where I am today. I'm a Muslim. I converted to Islam over the decades of incarceration. But and I used to sell oil for the Muslim community in the prisons that I was in. And one day, this guy, a gay man, he wanted to buy oil, and I refused to even acknowledge him. I refused to talk to him, acknowledge that he existed, and walked right past his cell. And several days later, he approached me in his cell as I was doing my oil selling and asked me if he could please have a conversation with me. I said, yeah, what do you want? I thought he wanted to buy some oil. He says, I hear that you're a revolutionary. I said, yeah, where's that going? He said, well, you being a revolutionary, how do you justify oppressing me? I walked away because I didn't have an answer. It took me several days to really think about that and try to justify oppressing. Am I oppressing him, first of all? I'm not acknowledging his existence, that he exists, that he's a human being. And that's creating harm. I went back and I apologized to him. I said it wasn't going to happen again. You're a human being, and I'm going to recognize and respect your humanity. And I will encourage others to do the same, even if I lose friendships. So this is an example of how we grow in prison and how we have to embrace all oppressed people's humanity, especially those who are oppressed with us. So with RAP, we develop principal coalitions with all organizations who are fighting the same fight. We are careful about those who advocate for reforms that do not lead to decarceration. Mm-hmm. Reforms that throw people under the bus, that say it's okay, I was convicted of a nonviolent crime, so I should be free. The ones convicted of violent crime should die in prison. So these are the people we have problems, developing principal coalitions with. But anyone involved in this fight to decarcerate, anyone involved in this fight to uproot the legacy of racism, we are their allies. And we will continue to develop these type of relationships with every human being that we possibly can.
Yes, thank you. Sarah had asked the question, how do we create these loving, respectful connections with our neighbors and our communities and with people during this pandemic? And so I started to answer that, certainly with regards to that story, that interaction amongst human beings, and how do we see and value each other's and affirm each other's humanity, which of course has been spoken to very specifically, is spoken to in terms of culture, and I think really important to uplift that. We also have had several comments affirming our need for economic stability and community reinvestment, and how defunding the police and really reinvestment regarding the entire system is necessary for building community. We had a question also that speaks to the panelists' consensus in describing the need for linking decarceration to a need for a new social and a new economic system, essentially. We talked about, alluded to capitalism and the way it functions in this society. And Benjamin was asking, could we talk more about that the economic system's impact and how that feeds and is a pillar to this system as we know it?
I could talk about that or start that conversation. I think if we just look kind of pragmatically, you start with federal and just start with government budgets. Look at federal, state, and city budgets. My work as a public policy attorney is in looking at public policy, looking at where our government priorities are and looking at how we spend money. And so on one hand, you have these corporations who have left communities. We call that deindustrialization, where they've left a lot of these Rust Belt cities and have gone to race to a bottom for profit. So they go to other states, other cities, other countries where they're not paying as much in labor. And that created a vacuum in jobs. And so if you look at a state like Wisconsin, it has the highest Black male joblessness rate in the country. And it also has the highest Black male incarceration rate. And that is not a coincidence. If you look at what researchers say, they note that prison programs, the prison industrial complex replaced jobs programs. So they replaced those prisons with jobs, but who's getting those jobs? And so that's where you turn to, where does the government step in? And if the government is focused on appealing to a certain segment of people so that they could keep their jobs, stay in office, because crime and punishment is very political, it is very appealing to a lot of white Americans. And then of course, some Black Americans as well, who are, experiencing, some of this criminal activity. But a lot of white Americans are drawn to a narrative of criminality to feel safe. And what happens is you have the government sector, you have the public sector that addresses that harm by saying, hey, we're giving you jobs because of this. So I think what we have to do is, on a local and state level, is change our priorities about where we're spending the money. It's that simple. Like, you could easily, it's a line item. Go from the NYPD or the APD, Atlanta Police Department, or wherever, Minneapolis Police Department, and put that money into these other programs that are being underfunded consistently. And then if you look on a federal level, progressive taxation is one, but we also have our own currency. We print our own money. So I would recommend that anybody involved in this work look at modern monetary theory. It is proposed by a lot of economists, very well-respected economists right now, who are saying we don't need to be concerned about, we can have a deficit. We've had a deficit. We get into a deficit for $1 trillion wars and $1 billion bailouts and $1 trillion bailouts. We need to be bailing out Main Street. And so I think that will minimize the kind of race and class conflict that you have from white Americans who feel that there's a status threat, that they don't have jobs. Well, if people are getting healthcare across the board, if people are getting education across the board, or people are getting employed in non-prison related jobs across the board, there's going to be less of a proclivity to say, well, I'm gonna get mine and whoever else is in prison because I need a job. Well, that's just on them. So I think if you reorient government priorities in response to capitalist decisions of corporate managers, then you're going to have a better dynamic, which trickles down into public safety and social safety and security for Black and Brown communities.
Yes, thank you for that. And it really, the impact, the ripple effect is so important, and that we connect these dots. And so thank you for that question, and also for that response. And I believe it connects to another question. When you connected the dots to another question, which was raised around, are there models for decarceration that we can turn to? Are the successful models? I think we've been talking about that. Errol raised that question. We've been talking about that from several aspects with regard to policy and legislation and defunding efforts and what have you. I don't know if anyone would like to speak to that. One thing I might add just to the conversation as a part of models of decarceration, I mean, one of the ways, just even in our experience, both in New York, but now in DC at the system here, of keeping people out of locked facilities, decarcerated, has been through the support network provided by credible messengers, people who have been previously impacted by the system, who are now hired working with local grassroots organizations and to work with court-involved young people and to be their mentors and their supporters and their big brothers and sisters, to walk with them and support them. And it's also beginning to happen with some people over the age of 18 or over the age of 21 who are legally, in the adult population. And so it's like example of a turn to community to invest in the capacity of community. And so I think this reinvestment piece is so powerful that you've all been talking about, that we can reinvest and support local grassroots people to be those supporters, to be those sponsors, mentors for people. And so there are examples of that happening, and it translating into those same folks not being incarcerated, being in the community because they have this wraparound of support. And that has been something that some courts have turned to and have been interested in continuing to grow. But it's an area of work that it's one example of building the community's capacity to really take over the responsibility for healing and helping and nurturing folks who have been involved in the system. If there are any, I'm looking for any more questions, but certainly any other models or efforts that you all are working on, please feel free to share those. I think that as we start coming closer to the end of this session, unfortunately, the time has gone by so quickly. And there's so much more to say, but it's been so extremely rich sharing of ideas and of actual work that's being done. I would like to just ask if there's any, until we meet again and until we continue, and as we continue to do our work, if there are some closing comments or statements from the panel that you'd like to share with us today.
Yes, I like to, speak on behalf of the mostly elders that I left behind, because they're so close to me, and Sali Abdullah's death did not have to happen. But I think that men and women who have languished in prison for decades, being a service to the prison community, not the administration, but to their fellow incarcerated men and women. They have dedicated decades of their life uplifting them. And in uplifting them, they uplift themselves. And this is why I am the person I am today, because they existed, because they struggled, and some of them have passed away already, but some are still languishing in prison. And they have a place in our community. They have a place because they have knowledge and experience that can help, that can be a part of the solution-making process. And this is why I'm so focused on releasing these men and women. And I just want to uplift the story of a woman named Valerie Gator in Bedford Hills State Prison for Women in New York State. Iconic woman, numerous degrees, but that wasn't what made her iconic. What made her iconic is that every formerly incarcerated woman that I've run into since I've been out here, they attribute their transformation to Val Gator. She was left to die, the longest serving woman in New York State Prison. At 61 years old, she was misdiagnosed with cancer and left to die. This is a devastation. This hurts so much that we cannot allow men and women who have been so instrumental in saving the lives of younger people, we cannot leave them to die in prison. Not when we need them out here. And we should do everything we can to make sure that they get out.
Thank you, Brother Saldana, for lifting that up, and for your awesome leadership and continuing this fight to address these really horrific practices that continue. And I know I speak for others, those who are connected with you and those who yet to have connect, that we walk with you and support the work that you're doing. Malaika, would you like to offer some closing thoughts?
Sure
Yes,
thing. And I think Shawanna will be able to take it away with the closing remarks.
Yes.
So I want to reiterate that transforming justice to me is also about transforming our consciousness. It means not just rethinking our systems, but rethinking how we think about criminality, what we think about what it means to be just, how we think about who deserves to be humanized and who's worthy of protection, who's worthy of saving, who's worthy of investing in. And we have to understand our own self-worth in that. And I go back to a quote, from Stephen Biko about the most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. And so I think we have to think on a more revolutionary level and be involved in programs that will help us basically see the light, because this is what we know. From the moment we got off, we freed ourselves from plantations, we were being funneled into the criminal justice system. We were being funneled into prisons. The penitentiaries have replaced the plantations. And so if this is what we know and this is what we're familiar with, we also as people who care about justice have to say, how do we end that? And what does it look like to really be free? What does it look like to really be liberated? And that's going to involve some trust. So I really do think that it's going to require us, including myself, taking lessons from abolitionists. Again, going to finding resources where we can unlearn what we believe is possible. Like, that is a huge step. If we do not unlearn what we even believe is possible, if we're only limited by what the oppressors tell us what is possible, we're not going to see what liberation looks like. We're not going to feel it. We need to manifest that. And I think relying on visionaries like, Angela Davis and Miriam Kaba and Ruth Wilson Gilmore, as I mentioned earlier, I think is important for us to understand what our communities can look like. So again, please, I encourage people to go to 8 to Abolition. That's the number 8 to abolition.com, criticalresistance.org. Read the work of the people who have been steeped in this, so that we can unlearn what this oppressive system taught us is normal, because it's not normal and we shouldn't accept it.
Thank you so much, Malaika, for all your contributions today and for that challenge, that closing challenge. And it's one that we definitely want to uplift and take and move on as we continue to do this work. And Shawanna, if you would, please share with us your parting thoughts. I think you're muted. Okay, I don't know if others can hear. Shawanna, can you check to see if you're muted?
Oh, can you hear me? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I know we missed something really good. If you could say that again.
Okay. So I was saying, thank you, Mr. Lacey. Thank you, Malaika. Thank you, Mrs. Saldana. And, I just want to highlight all the work, like you said, that RAC is doing, all the work you've done, Mr. Lacey, for New York and DC and everybody. Malaika, thank you for working on change and policy and abolition. But right now, we have people incarcerated and they are silently crying. And I need them to know that we hear their cries. The pandemic, they're on overload. People right now inside need every organization and every human who is out here screaming Black Lives Matter to understand that people in prison matter too. That is someone's daughter, that is someone's son, these are someone's parents, and their life has value. November the 1st, I will be going to Corona Institution for Women in Corona, California. I am doing a rally at CIW. I would like bodies present. The rally is for inadequate health care of women that are in that institution. Um, one of my uh, friends who is there, she has cancer and she was diagnosed with COVID, and she's in trouble. And I'm going to go and see what I can do on her behalf. Um, Dorita Gale Stevenson is not in prison alone. There are other women suffering with her. And I want everybody who is in Southern California to show up, because this could very well be your daughter, your mother. She has value, not just to me, but to her family and everybody else. I also want to say to Mr. Elijah Robinson, who is in Michigan, and Gus Harrison, who has kidney failure and hadn't had a cent changed in a year. We have to do better. We have to do better. And we have to hold the Department of Corrections and BOP accountable, because we are humans. We are more than the numbers that are attached and branded to us. And I will never forget that I am W76337. So I will continue to stand in the gap for your silent cries and answer as many as I can. But I really need people to understand that there are lives at stake, and decarceration must take place, and policy and legislation must be passed. So I'm asking you to stand with me in passing post-traumatic prison disorder, Shawanna W76337. Senator Brian Benjamin in New York is the person who's holding my legislation. Write, call, email, and understand that the person who's moving in next to you might be the person with the remnants from prison. It is vital that we have policies and legislations in place to create wellness and wholeness. Thank you.
Thank you, Shawanna, for bringing us to a close of this particular session. And thank you so much for being who you are, who you are and what you do. We stand with you, and we stand together, all of us. We must stand together. So we're so grateful to the entire panel, and to the conveners of this discussion today, and to the audience, of course, for participating, to our brothers and sisters in the communities who are continuing to fight the fight, and those who are continuing to fight the fight from inside of the beast, of the monster of a system that we're seeking and continuing to transform. Our struggle continues, our work continues, and I'm certainly encouraged and humbled to have had the opportunity to be a part of this conversation and to meet three awesome leaders in the work. At this point, we're going to close out the conversation with a brief video. So until we meet again, be well, and let's continue this fight. Thank you.